Welcome to Tomorrow Never Knows with me, Bob Wilson, and Sir Warren Brown, our gifted Minister of Art. We have a very special guest tonight that we're lucky to have, especially given the Get Back series being on television, so he's in higher demand than even usual. Of course, I speak of author Bruce Spicer. He's joining us now in the Beatles Kingdom. Bruce will be expounding on Get Back and his book that I think is better than the Get Back book that was released. It's much more informational, in my opinion. The Beatles Finally Let It Be. And of course, there's the latest in Bruce's Beatles album series, Magical Mystery Tour and Yellow Submarine, which is there combined in one book. That's really wonderful. So, welcome to the show, Bruce.
Glad to be back again. Always fun being around with some Beatle nerds who really know their stuff.
Well, not nearly as much as you, so I like listening to you, but I just got some questions and then we're going to let you go because you're our resident expert. Uh,
All
rumor
right.
has it, rumor has it that the Beatles just released Get Back on Disney. My sources tell me. So
You
I
got
know
to be
that
joking, really? Oh my
at
God.
least I have it on
I need
some
to get
authority.
I need to get Disney Plus.
I hear you. So I'm sure that you had that tuned in. And what say you? Now you've had a chance to see all three. What'd you think of it? And I know, as I said, I think your book, The Beatles Finally Let It Be, is better than the one that they released accompanying this current Disney deal. But as you've been watching, what have your thoughts been? What's gone through the mind of Bruce Spicer?
Well, I always said after Let It Be, when I heard there was all this outtake footage, that you could take the film, all the hours, and re-edit it and make a really incredible film. And that's what Peter Jackson did. He is a humongous Beatles fan, which really helps. He has people that work with him that turned, out of sync black and white World War II film into glorious full color on the screen. So I knew he would be able to take the Twickenham film that was 16 millimeter and make it look pristine. And he did that. So it looks great. With the work of Giles Martin and Sam O'Kell, I knew the sound would be spectacular. And it is. What I found really interesting was, for watching it the first time through, a lot of those conversations, which I might not want to watch a dozen or so times, but the first go round, you learn some really interesting things. And I did appreciate that. On the other hand, the only real complaint I have, and bear in mind, this is nearly 8 hours long. So to correct what I would want, it'd have to be at least 10 hours long, would be more complete performances of the songs. And that, I did find disappointing. Um, where it stood out the most was when you did Let It Be, the idea of the film was we want to end with the rooftop concert. Peter Jackson took a day by day approach, which I think was the way to go. And that meant that after the rooftop concert, you still had another day back in the studio. And I love the fact that after the rooftop, he shows them down in the Apple basement in the control room, listening to the playback, and you can see the looks of relief and happiness. So, hey, we pulled it off. And then I'm expecting, maybe we'll get something like, some of the acoustic songs like Take This Hammer. And then we're going to get Two of Us, and we're going to get Long and Winding Road, and we're going to get Let It Be. And instead, we get Take This Hammer, and then we go to the credits and we get a little bit of those other three songs. Now, while I wasn't happy about that, the good news is Let It Be is going to be remastered and put out. And when it is, I can watch those three songs at the end of Let It Be if I really have to get my fix on that. So while I would have done a few things differently, it's a solid A no matter how you slice it. Really great film, and I really enjoyed it.
Now, as we were building up to watching it, and you had all the magazine articles and like the shows like, I'm trying to think, just the entertainment shows with having clips. They were building it up like that, there's all this footage that you had referred to, but really in these outtakes, they're getting along like splendidly. And it shows that they really were just having fun. And in my like at the end of part one, I think George like quit, and
Yeah.
I was just wondering, like, why did they build the hype up so much where they had to be getting along and it had to be that way? Did you really find it to be that way as you watched it?
Well, I wasn't worried about it being a whitewash. I trusted Peter Jackson. And, when you're watching the film, I mean, I knew when they were messing around with talking about you that the end was near for George. And I was noticing, though, if you look at George's facial expressions leading up to when he quits, he has this brooding type of look and serious and contemplating. He's not smiling. And when he calmly stands up and says, I'm leaving the group now, I'm thinking, yeah, you've been thinking about it for the past hour. I can see that. And it's very calm. John, when, now, and write the enemy and get a few replacements, very matter of factly, and sticks around and talks for another minute or two on Apple things, and he's gone. And I like the way that they had the calendar showing the day by day. I like the way they put text over at times, to let us know, oh, this is what happens. George has left the group. A meeting is held at Ringo's house, attended also by Lindo and Yoko. The meeting doesn't go well, and I thought, the whole way it was handled was really brilliant. So I like the way they handled George's quitting the group. You could see it coming, just on the way Paul was being a bit bossy, and we didn't really see if George was upset with Yoko. Maybe that didn't make the film, but you could just, it didn't come as a shock to me. I knew it was going to happen, but looking at his face, it really told a lot.
Something jumped out at me as I was watching it. Um, when he came in with, was it All Things Must Pass?
Yeah.
And he played that song, it was like shot down, which people have mentioned. And then, people were saying, well, Paul was the one fighting with George. But then he came in with, was it I Me Mine? And then John was saying, we're a rock and roll band, son. Like,
Yeah.
what was the deal where the songs that did make Let It Be by George didn't seem to be as good as the, not knocking them, but the ones that didn't make it, like, All Things Must Pass, why wouldn't they pick a song like that? Was it just because of the way things were happening sort of pell-mell, or was there a decision? Like, why did they throw that song away so quickly?
I think the problem, and you need more than in that documentary. If you listen to all 83 discs of the outtakes, what you hear is that George has this great song, All Things Must Pass, and it's not fair to say the band ignored it. They spent a lot of time on that song. The problem was Paul had different ideas that did not work. Paul was trying some backing vocals and other things that really were ruining the arrangement. And I think George got kind of frustrated, with that and didn't really stand up to Paul and say, no, Paul, that's not working. I don't want you singing backing vocals on the song till we get to the chorus. And so I think he was frustrated with how the arrangements were going with it. Later on in part two, and they have this wonderful bit where John arrives late after there's already been a frank 10-minute discussion about George leaving the group, or even Linda is participating in it and saying some thoughtful things. But John and Paul are having lunch, and they don't know it, but they're being secretly recorded. And one of the things that John says is, you're telling George how you want him to play, and you're also, telling me how to arrange my songs. I don't go doing that to you. And Paul, trying to defend himself, says, well, you've always been the boss. And John says, not always. So, there obviously was tension from that. And they realize it, just like John says, George has this wound and we're not doing anything to help it. We're making it worse. So, they recognize what's going on. And Paul says, well, I assume George is going to, be in the band, and let's, then they agree to try to make it work. I think one of the other fun moments is that I learned from the film. We had always gotten the impression, and I think Glenn Johns was happy for people to have the impression, that George Martin wasn't around that much. This film shows George Martin was around a lot. And he says some interesting things. So the remark I love, the typical George Martin understatement in putting things in proper perspective, is Paul, they're talking about the show, and Paul, this is after George has quit, and Paul says, let's do it at the Cavern. And I think Mo is there, and she says, yes. And then George says, well, location's really not your main problem now. putting it in proper perspective. Hey guys, George just quit the group. So I think that's a really telling moment.
When John had remarked so quickly, "Let's get Clapton," or something to
Yeah.
that effect. Like I know, like you had that, spoken about that before in your book and such. But was he serious, or was he, because you're catching somebody off the cuff? Like, was he just angry, or was Eric Clapton like really? Could he have been close to have being given an invitation to come in and join the group? Bless you.
Well, I don't think it would have been to join the Beatles. I think it was more of, we want to do this show. Let's just get Clapton if he won't do it. The Beatles weren't necessarily going to be doing any of George's songs in the show. So on the rooftop, they didn't. Although, for those who are observant, if you look at those rooftop scenes, you will see that Hawaiian guitar is up there. There's also a Fender Reverb amp with no guitars plugged into it, and there's a table above that to where John could have sat down back there and played the Hawaiian steel guitar on For You Blue, and George's acoustic guitar is also up there. So, but anyway, I guess the point I'm trying to make is Clapton could have come in and played George's lead guitar parts without any problem. But I don't think it ever was an idea, we're going to get Eric to join the Beatles.
And another thing jumped out at me that you probably knew already, but it kind of struck me, like they were obviously playing George, as we know about. A lot of them went on to All Things Must Pass, the album. But some of the
Yeah,
songs, and we knew John had a few, and he changed like the title later, and he used the tune. But I was kind of taken when I didn't know "Gimme Some Truth" was being bandied around, and unless I was dreaming at that point in the show, and I imagine this, was Paul on "Gimme Some Truth" singing that with John during the show? That kind of surprised me.
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
I was surprised that was in there. I didn't expect that one. And then some of the stuff like from McCartney, I didn't know that, was being bandied around in this session.
Yeah. When he was doing the solo stuff on piano, I find it interesting that he's playing piano and Another Day is pretty much complete. And then he puts Linda is co-writing the song. And no wonder why Northern Songs was claiming foul. And particularly, they didn't realize how foul that was. I don't see what Linda could have possibly contributed to Another Day, as that song was pretty much complete at the time. But it was cool hearing him do that on piano, Woman on piano, Backseat of My Car. And also, I had absolutely no idea that Carry That Weight, which turned into Paul kind of singing about himself carrying that weight of the Beatles. Originally, that song started out, it was going to be a barrelhouse piano English dance hall tune for Ringo to sing. If, boy, you got to carry that weight, the wife's gotten drunk and, all stuff like that. And I mean, that was very illuminating to see how Carry That Weight transitioned for a country westernish type English song for Ringo into, Paul's song for Abbey Road.
On Abbey Road, just taking from what you had just said, what jumps into my mind is when they did the medley, like as you're
Mhm.
saying, that song is so different from what the medley was. Whose vision was it, or more than one person that put the medley together from what it had been into what it became?
Well, I think, Paul and George Martin were really working on that medley, and it was really their work. It's interesting that Ringo is singing in this film Carry That Weight along with Paul. And then on the Beatles version of Carry That Weight, it's Paul, George, and Ringo. John's not there for that session. So Ringo had already had some practice singing that song from the Get Back sessions.
Yeah, thanks for filling us in on that. That I never knew that, and that's very interesting that it started out in that way. Now, I mentioned your book before, The Beatles Finally Let It Be. It has a ton of information, a ton of pictures, posters from the era, memorabilia from the era. It's printed really nicely. It's one of my favorite books, and Warren said it's also among his favorites, if not his favorite.
Well, thank
And
you.
oh no, it's easy enough to say it's true. But was it, as you watched it and you followed so much and you know so many inside stories, did the new documentary present a lot you didn't know? And turning that around, did your research have some things that maybe even Peter Jackson didn't know when he put this together?
Well, I don't know what Pete. I expect there was a lot Peter Jackson didn't know when he put it together, but he learned a lot, obviously, from looking at all that footage. The one thing that I really wasn't aware of was that, I thought when George agreed to come back to the group, it was no live TV show concert. but I didn't realize George was open to doing a concert. And they were talking about doing this outdoor concert on Primrose Hill. I knew nothing about that. I had to get out Wikipedia and see where Primrose Hill in London was. And it's kind of a little bit close to Regent Zoo and all. And it has a nice view of the city. So that would have been a pretty cool place to do the concert if they hadn't decided on the rooftop. So that was a big surprise to me. Primrose Hill, where did that come from? And all along, you really hear them talking about whether or not they're going to do the show. And it's never George saying, hell no, I won't go. George in his own mind is not a dead set against doing the show by any means. And there's even a time in there where Paul seems to be kind of wondering whether they should be doing the show or not. Unfortunately, we don't have film of the Beatles before they go up on the roof. And they met privately and then decided to go up there. It was probably a case of them sitting around and John just saying, "Oh, fuck it, let's go." It probably was that simple. But unfortunately, we don't have the sound or anything of that meeting. The other thing that was great to learn was I had always thought, okay, they had a couple of extra cameras. I never dreamed they went from 2 to 10 cameras for that. And I love the effect that they used for the rooftop concert. It reminded me of the film Woodstock, where you had those split screens of the bands where you would see different members of the band in the crowd and things. And on that rooftop concert, they went anywhere from one screen to a split screen of 2, 3, 4, and 6. And I thought it was very effective. I really enjoyed that segment.
Okay, we're going to hand over now to the very talented artist, Warren Brown.
Bruce, Bulldog was right. Your book, The Beatles Finally Let It Be, is my favorite of all the ones I've read. Back to the film Get Back, in episode 1, leading up to George's departure, you didn't see much of anything that happened to George that would make him leave. So when I was watching it with my wife, and that's the first thing she said to me, "What happened? Why is George leaving?" They showed nothing made him that mad to leave. His expressions and all, he wasn't happy, but they didn't show anything to lead up to that.
I think it builds up, and that's what you have to realize. It's not just the days at Twickenham. It's something that's been building up for a while. And there's a part in the film where Neil comes out, Neil Aspinall, and he says, well, look, it's, the two of John and Paul, where they're dominating to get the songs on. And George just has himself, and he's fighting to get his songs on. And it's no wonder he got pissed. So, and I think that's a very good observation by Neil. So I don't think it was any one thing in particular that did it, but it was just as the day's going on, that particular day, he's just brooding, and you can just see it in his face. And like I said, that was the only clue I had of the brooding and the unhappy look in his face. So when he stands up and says, "I'm leaving the band now," I mean, if it had been a row, it would have been, "I'm quitting this band. You guys can, whatever." He doesn't. It's just very calm. "I'm leaving the band now." When? Now.
Right.
So it wasn't any big fight. It was just something that had been building in George, not only for a couple of days, but perhaps a couple of years.
Right. And something that was brought up between you and Bob about Eric Clapton.
But one other thing, though, I did want to mention, and that was that, John came into this really unprepared as far as a batch of songs. George, on the other hand, had a whole batch of songs. And not only that, but he's still knocking them out. Oh, last night I just wrote, "I'm Me Mine," or "I just wrote For You Blue." I mean, George was just hitting his stride at that point. And like he later on says, "I'm thinking of doing a solo album because at the rate of 2 or 3 a year, it'll take me, 10 years to put these songs out." So I think it was, something that had been building.
Right. They mentioned bringing Eric Clapton in. If I can remember correctly, Paul was basically telling George to improv. And George was basically telling Paul that he's not good at improv. And if he wanted improv, he ought to bring Eric Clapton in. Am I correct on that?
Well, there was a part like that, but the other thing is that it was really a case of George liked to play riffs. He's a lead guitar player. Paul wanted everything simple first, then complicated. But I think, bear in mind, George did bring Eric Clapton in for While My Guitar Gently Weeps. And I think George, he was good friends with Eric, respected him, of course, as a musician. But I think really it wasn't so much Paul asking him to improv. I don't think that was really the issue. The issue was Paul telling George what to play. I want you to play it this way. And then also there were times where George, as a lead player, would want to put in riffs in certain places. And Paul would say, no, let's, I want to keep it simple. We can complicate it later, but we have to concentrate and get it simple. And that was the discussion they were really having during Two of Us. And, we see that in the a more expanded edition of it in this film. And it correctly comes after Two of Us. And Let It Be, it comes after I've Got a Feeling, which is, of course, the wrong place for it in the film. But it was interesting to see a more expanded discussion about that. It's certainly a frustration of George's, but once again, one of the things that kind of leads up to him saying, okay, I'm quitting the band now. I've had enough.
Well, as the movie went on and you went into episode 2 and George came back, he seemed quite happy. Is there anything that might have went on in the 2 meetings beforehand that we don't know about that maybe you do?
No, I think the main thing was George didn't want to be working toward doing this live TV show. He didn't have faith in that. And also he didn't like working out of Twickenham. And he really had an idea that they were going to have this wonderful studio in Apple and had no idea the mess it would be in. One of the things we learned from the film is that George goes over to Twickenham and he and Glenn Johns go together over to Apple to see what Alex has done. Now, we had heard horror stories about it, but I had never learned that George and Glenn Johns were the pair that went over there to try it out first. The other thing I didn't know was that when you had Glenn Johns, we knew he had recorded some things at Twickenham. They were never released, but it was on an 8-track. We now know it was George's 8-track that had been brought over to Twickenham. When it arrives, George says, who's going to be providing security for this stuff? Because, that's really expensive. And then at Apple, we learned that the console that you had Magic Alex do gave a lot of distortion and humming. And so Glenn Johns was the one who called up George Martin and said, hey, we need something from EMI. Do you have portable? And so what they did was they lined up 2 4-track portables from EMI consoles, and they hooked that up to George's 8-track recorder. So once again, it's George's 8-track recorder that they're recording on in the Apple basement. I had no idea of that. So that was something that I learned from the film.
Yes, that's very interesting. After the first Let It Be movie came out, people started blaming Yoko for the breakup of the Beatles. From the looks of this Get Back movie, Yoko wasn't the only one in the studio. You had Linda, you had you had a bunch of people. George had some people from India sitting there. So why do you think people started blaming Yoko when this movie don't really show Yoko interfering with anything?
Well, look, let's take things back to what happened before Let It Be came out. Before Let It Be comes out, the Beatles have broken up. And we want to know why. So we go to this film, and in it, we see the 4 Beatles and Yoko always at John's side. And so in our mind, aha, that must be Yoko. Now, one of the things that was interesting was the first meeting that didn't go well. The day after that, when they're at Twickenham, Linda makes the observation, that wasn't John talking. Yoko was talking for John. And Paul agrees with that. And I'm sure that's something that upset George, because George wants to know what John thinks, not what Yoko thinks John thinks. So, that's part of it. The interesting thing, there's a little bit, actually, there are a lot of irony and foreshadowing in this film. One of the things that I like is at the beginning of part 1, George brings this Hare Krishna to the studio. At the beginning of part 2, the Hare Krishnas send flowers for George. And George, of course, isn't there because he just quit the group. That's kind of fun. And then, of course, the wonderful irony of Paul saying, 50 years from now, they're going to say these guys broke up because Yoko sat on an amp. And here we are, 50 years. Well, actually, it's a little more than 50 years, but, you get the idea. And we're still saying stuff like that. So I like that type of foreshadowing that was in the film.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, and one other cute thing he says, he's talking about, John wanting to be with Yoko. And he says, look, we can't push John on this. And someone asked him, well, what would happen if you were to push him? And Paul says, and then there would be 2, meaning George has quit, John will quit, then there'll only be 2 remaining Beatles, Paul and Ringo. Of course, tragically, that's where we are now, 2 remaining Beatles, Paul and Ringo.
Correct. What did you think about the rooftop concert and Get Back?
Well, like I said earlier, I loved it because you had, 10 cameras and the split screen and everything. And I thought I was going to be annoyed by the cut-ins from remarks from the crowd, but I really wasn't. One of the tricks they used was when it was a close-up shot of the band, the sound was absolutely crisp. And if there was a far back shot of the band, or they were having the roving camera, they added a touch of echo to it to give you the idea of, hey, this view is from further away. This is what it would have sounded like had you been further away. I thought that was an interesting effect. So, while some people might complain about it being gimmicky or not pure, or gee, I'd just like to have seen it on one camera, the entire thing. I personally liked it. I thought it was well done. The other thing was I didn't realize how quickly the British Bobbies got there. I mean, they were on the scene almost immediately. They kept saying, we've had 30 calls on this, and they never really updated that. So they got those initial phone calls complaining, and that was about it. The crowd reactions were great. Some of the older people really liked it. And then I liked the one guy saying, well, it's nice to have something free these days, isn't it? So, the comments were great.
What I was curious about is when they switched over from Twickenham, they had 1 day no film inside the studio at Abbey Road. Is there a reason for that? And was that being recorded also, just not shown in the film?
Well, I don't think they really was shooting film because, for the most part, the Beatles, they weren't going to be there except to test out the studio. So why waste film on that? And I think that was the reason, they're in the Apple Studio basement trying to get the place ready for recording. So what would have been the point of having a film crew there watching EMI equipment arrive and them trying to hook things up? So I think it's just a case of saving the film. I don't think there was anything private that the group was worried about being filmed.
Thank you for that. And I'm going to hand it back over to the Bulldog to see if he's got any more questions. I'll get back to you shortly there, Bruce.
All right.
Later on, there was an interview with John Lennon. And in it, it's kind of a famous quote, but I'm paraphrasing. But he said, as far as George goes, we were bastards, meaning him and Paul. And George really flourished since the band broke up. But, as George fought to get his songs on, of course, everybody wants to have their song. When George said, we all had big egos. But beyond egos, was it also copyrights? I mean, if you got a song on the album and you wrote it, basically you'd still be getting paid today. So, my point is, was part of it that they were shutting him out because they were getting the financial rewards of having more of their songs on the albums?
I would say in John's case, and this is just, I'm just guessing, in John's case, it was more initially did not respect George as a songwriter. I think in Paul's case, it was more for the money. And I may be wrong on that. That's just a guess.
It's interesting because you know so much about it, and it's interesting to know what you say about it, but it's just not brought up often. I don't see people touch on that. It's not a real flattering answer as far as Paul goes in that particular instance. But you brought up George Martin before, and I'm just unclear. When he was there, and then they had to ask him back for Abbey Road, and they, he said we're going to do it the old way or no way. I'm paraphrasing. And then during the White Album, I believe he walked out for a time.
He went on vacation. It was a planned vacation.
Oh, so it wasn't that he just walked out on the session. But
no. Jeff Emmerich walked out and quit. But as far as George Martin, it was a planned vacation. But I will say this, if everything had been warm and fuzzy, I think he would have changed his vacation plans.
So it was a little tense in there, to say the least.
For the
But
White Album, absolutely.
as Let It Be was going on, and you were mentioning George was there, and you were seeing him in the studio, what was different about what he was doing on Let It Be? I'm unclear on it, because he was there, but what was different? Obviously, the sound was very different, but what was George doing, and why was his role, in my understanding, so ambiguous? Like, what was going on there?
Well, as I've said, we had always been led to believe it was minimal, but that really wasn't the case. Paul and John wanted to bring in Glenn Johns because they had seen his work with the Rolling Stones. They had sung backing vocals on "We Love You" and probably "Dandelion" at Olympic Studios, and Glenn Johns was probably the engineer over there, so they knew him. They wanted to see what he would be like, and so Glenn Johns ends up being the balance engineer. George Martin wasn't there 100% of the time at Twickenham because they were just rehearsing. He did go to Twickenham, but he didn't feel like he needed to be there all the time. And there were times at Twickenham where Glenn Johns is making suggestions with the arrangements. So he certainly had a larger role than most engineers may have. When they were over at Apple, George Martin and Glenn Johns were both there a lot of the times. But as the balance engineer, Glenn Johns is the one largely responsible for getting the sound that they were getting. And, at times it was George Martin, in one case, has almost a subservient role where Glenn suggests to Paul he doesn't like the sound he's getting from the Hofner. And Paul takes out, his Rickenbacker, and George Martin is on the studio floor fiddling with the knobs of the bass. And that would be something that I would have thought, at Abbey Road, George Martin would have been at the controls and would have sent one of the other engineers out on the floor. But maybe I'm making too much of that. The other interesting thing was Paul knew that this was going to be a concert. So he shows up at Twickenham with the, Hofner fiddler bass. He's got his Hofner violin bass there. And one of the things he says about it is it's lighter. So I think maybe one of the reasons he brought it was it looks very cool, of course. That was part of it. But it is lighter. He's thinking concert. Do I really want to wear this heavy Rickenbacker when I can be wearing that nice little Hofner I wore all those years in concert? And Paul ended up sticking with the Hofner. There are only a few tracks he is on the Rickenbacker. The other thing, we knew that George had this Fender Telecaster that he used a lot. But in the early days of the film in particular, he's more on his Les Paul. And then later on, you see him switching from a Telecaster to the Les Paul and even the Stratocaster. So it's not strictly the Telecaster, at least while they're rehearsing the songs. I found that interesting.
So it seemed natural that if I was going to have a final record, and I do have to have a final record, that it should be with music that the Beatles had written. I didn't really want to go down the well-worn routes. I didn't want to do Yesterday and Let It Be and so on.
I belabor the point simply because I want to understand it and I don't quite get it. So when they brought George Martin back for Abbey Road and they had the discussion,
I thought I would ask all my pals and my heroes to join me on this album. I'm best known, of course, for Beatle music, and so everybody kind of expects me to perform Beatle songs. I thought, well, let's have a go at doing some Beatle songs, but with a different...
I'm obviously paraphrasing, and Paul McCartney says, "We want you back." And then George Martin said something to the effect of, "Well, it's going to have to be the way it used to be." You can correct me on my paraphrase, but
yeah,
so they're bringing him back. But what had happened in the interim? Like, in other words, you said Jeff Emmerich quit at the White Album. I know you have a book out about the White Album. And
yep.
and Ringo walked out during the White Album, so things were pretty tense from those sessions on, if I have a handle on it. But what happened with George Martin then when he said, they had to ask him back for Abbey Road? In the past, it would it have just been, and I don't mean to overtalk it, but if they normally George Martin would have been back as a matter of course, right? So why do they have
Yeah.
to specially go to him and say, you know, it's going to be like it was, you know, please come back?
Nobody can deny that there's something there.
Having spent about 46 years in the recording business, I decided it was time to wrap up my tents and steal away.
Well, I think, look, he found the White Album to be a frustrating experience, certainly. And then on Let It Be, John's attitude is, look, you know, there are going to be no overdubs, so we're going to keep playing it over and over again till we get it the way we want it. And George Martin had gone past those days. He and the Beatles had learned how to use the studio in ways no one had used it before. In the Get Back album, they got back so far, and George Martin, I think, didn't want to do it that way anymore. So it was.
There was a time when I got really fed up with being known as the Beatles producer. It seemed as though I'd never done anything else in my life. But time eases a lot of things, and it certainly eases that, because I realised that it was something to be really proud of. And they're my mates, you know, and I've been with them for 35 years.
Anymore. So it
So
wasn't so much a case of, we fired you, because they never really did fire him. They brought in Glenn Johns as a balance engineer. George Martin was still officially the producer. And so I think that, you know, was an overstatement on that. I think, though, that what Paul was trying to tell them was, look, we're going to do it the way we used to do it, you know, and you know, you can do it the way you want to do it, because the White Album, and particularly Get Back, was done the way the Beatles or John wanted to do it. And Paul was basically saying, we want to do this album and let it be done the way you think it should be done. I think that was the difference. It wasn't so much him being fired, but just the style that had been used. They agreed to go back to the good old days with George Martin making a lot of the decisions, with George Martin and Paul working out this medley for side 2 and those types of things.
It starts off deceptively simply. It is like, it is a lullaby. And Paul McCartney originally sang it very gently to a beautiful piano phrase that he concocted, a very open phrase. Once there was a way, orchestra, to get back homeward.
Then this is a what if question, so it's not really, I'm asking this spontaneously, so I'm sort of putting you on the spot. But if
All
they
right.
had done into the studio under regular conditions, by meaning George Martin's in the control booth, and I think Jeff Emmerich had quit by now, but if he was there, and they had the songs they had for Let It Be, and say George had some of the songs from All Things Must Pass. And again, I'm hashing it out because I'm asking this completely spontaneously, so it's not, you know, putting you on the spot. But had they released Let It Be, and it was recorded under the normal conditions, and not kind of what we saw in the Get Back documentary, and they had chosen slightly different tracks, and George recorded them under normal quote conditions, what might Let It Be have looked like? And again, I'm asking you this, you know, back on your heels. This question is, you know, spontaneous.
I think it would have been very similar to the album Let It Be Naked, you know, except that you may have had tasteful strings on Long and Winding Road. I think George Martin wanted to put strings on Long and Winding Road, and I think Paul was okay with it. He just wasn't happy with the over-the-top arrangement that Phil Spector did, particularly that annoying harp at the end. But I think it would have been that type of album. And look, I used to love Let It Be Naked when it first came out. And then years later, when I was doing the Beatles Finally Let It Be book, and I listened to the Glenn Johns mix and everything else, when I listened to that album, it sounded brilliant, but it had no soul. So I missed the banter between the tracks and things like that. And so it's just kind of interesting of I don't know if the ultimate Let It Be album or Get Back album has ever come out. Glenn Johns' album was flawed because he took rough performances when there were better performances. He could have used the studio banter of John saying, let's do Dig a Pony into I've Got a Fever, and then use the rooftop performances for those two songs. It would have been a better album. So it never quite got right, but I think maybe the closest we're going to get is that Giles Martin, Sam Ocal remix. I really love it because some of the things I absolutely hated about Let It Be, I don't so much hate anymore. I didn't like Across the Universe. It had this wall of sound, murky sound. And all of a sudden, Giles is treating the orchestra as a separate instrument, and I can hear it clearly, and it sounds fine. I mean, the strings don't bother me. Let It Be is not quite as annoying, although I still think that the brass and guitar at the end are a little bit too loud for my taste. The Long and Winding Road, not as annoying as it was, but I still prefer a simple piano ballad. But I kind of really do like the job that Giles Martin did on that remix.
Interesting. Now, before I hand back to Warren, because I think he's got a few more questions too, I asked about all the producers, and you brought up Phil Spector, so I'm interested in what you think of him at a little more length. But I love the Beach Boys, and Brian Wilson obviously thought so much of Phil Spector, and Brian Wilson's obviously a musical genius. And I listened for that Wall of Sound, Be My Baby, and it wasn't until I was a little older, like I liked the Beatles since I was 5. So when I start listening to, the other songs to see what did Brian Wilson see in this, I can appreciate it more as I get a little older. Some people might have gotten it much faster than me, but they brought, George brought Phil Spector back for some of his solo stuff, as did John. But to me, my untrained musicians, these guys, it just sounds so different from what I thought Brian Wilson might have seen in a Phil Spector. Like his production with them doesn't sound to me like a real wall of sound, like Be My Baby with all the sound coming at you. And then he seemed to be, in later events would kind of bear it out. Sort of a strange character to have around, like wearing a firearm and things like that. It would kind of scare me. But what are your thoughts on Phil Spector? And maybe you can set me straight from what I've, understood about him.
I mean, I thought he was a brilliant record producer, but I didn't like the muddiness of the wall of sound. I like the idea of a lot of instruments, but I like a lot of instruments having a clean sound, not this muddy sound that Phil Spector often got. One of the things about the Beach Boys productions, Brian Wilson was influenced by Spector and used a lot of the instruments, but when you listen to Pet Sounds, it doesn't sound muddy, it sounds clean. And so it's kind of like Brian kind of cleaned up the wall of sound. And I like that. I think in the remixes, what Giles Martin tried to do was clean up that wall of sound so it wasn't muddy. It's okay to have all these instruments, but let's have them to where you can actually hear the instruments rather than it being this wall of sound or wall of mud to a certain extent. So that's my take on it.
And when George and John worked with him, if I can belabor the question, what did you think of the results of their solo efforts with him behind the producers? What would you call it? Behind the producers' glass.
I thought that All Things Must Pass was overproduced. I thought that obviously Plastic Ono Band Spector just didn't do a wall of sound. I thought it was brilliant. Sounded great. And Imagine, with John and Yoko and Spector producing, once again, no real wall of sound. So the only recording that really got the wall of sound as far as albums go was All Things Must Pass. Still a brilliant album. It's just, as George admitted himself, looking back at it, I might have done it a little bit differently now.
What did you think about them bringing in Billy Preston? To me, one of the better musicians of that time in the 60s. And what did you think about the style of music that the Beatles were putting out? Because to me, he put a little into the Beatles' music. And that's exactly what they needed for this album, in my opinion.
Well, there are a lot of foreshadowing of the arrival of Preston, because then they're doing Don't Let Me Down. And John says, well, it could use a keyboard, but I want 2 guitars. And they have this no overdub policy. And then later on, John says, we could use a guy on piano, sort of like Nicky Hopkins with the Rolling Stones coming in. And George says, yeah, we need a fifth Beatle, another musician. And so when Preston shows up, their prayers are answered. And not only does Billy improve the atmosphere because, the Beatles are family. And when your families are around, sometimes you fight. But when company drops by, you don't want your friends and company to see you fighting. So you stop fighting. And I think that helped the atmosphere. And plus, right away, the piano adds some depth to some of these tracks that it didn't have before. So that I like a lot. The other thing I want to mention about the Beatles Finally Let It Be, because that book came out before all the new releases that had come out, a book, a box set, and the Peter Jackson documentary, I am working on, and it's about 80% done, a supplement that's going to be called The Beatles Finally Let It Be. And that will be available around mid-December, perhaps earlier. And if you go to my website, Beatle.net, you will be able to download that supplement for free. Now, those who purchase the collector's edition of the book will get a print copy mailed to them free. And, it also will have it available for purchase for those who would like to purchase a supplement, but it will be available as a free download, whether or not you've ever bought a book from me or not. So anyone listening, go to the website sometime in mid-December to Beatle.net and download the supplement for free and check out the other books, and you might find yourself buying a bunch of books there.
Let's go back through the Sea of Time, would you please, and stop our mystery tour at the Yellow Submarine. Please tell us about your newest book.
Well, one of the things about it is you've got two albums that you figured, do either one of these projects really deserve their own book? Yeah, but wouldn't it be fun to combine them? And the idea behind combining them in my mind came of, if I were to put a music collection about it, I would look at these as post-Pepper tracks. So think about the Beatles. They finished Sgt. Pepper, which turns out to be, the most important album in the history of rock and roll. And so, rather than going to Disneyland, Paul goes to the United States and visits with Jane Asher. And the Beatles come back. And what do? Do they take a couple of months off? No. They're back in the studio recording songs for this cartoon movie. Oh, by the way, boys, Brian tells them, we need a song for this worldwide broadcast. So you need to have it ready. We want to have you record it live from Abbey Road Studios. You got to write the song. Okay, no problem. We'll do that. All right, well, we have this TV special we're doing, so we need about a half a dozen songs we need to write and record, and we need to produce, direct, hire the actors, and do all the stuff to make our own TV spectacular. No problem, we'll do that. In the meantime, we've met the Maharishi. We want to go to India. Oh no, Brian's died. We want to go to India, but we can't go to India because we have these other projects. All right, let's go to India, but before we go to India, we need to record some songs. So what do? All right, we do Lady Madonna. John comes up with Across the Universe, which is almost like another All You Need Is Love type song. George says, when I was doing the Wonderwall soundtrack in India, I have this musical track that I think we could put, words over that I think would really be good. And so they do those songs, they get that done. And then the day that they're supposed to be in the studio, specifically for the purpose of miming Lady Madonna in front of a film crew for a promo visit, John says, we're songs short for the cartoon, so let's knock out Hey Bulldog. I mean, all of this is this incredible post-Pepper phase. And that's why I thought these two albums work so well together. In my previous books, I had given things from an American perspective first and then British. Why? Because I grew up in America, and America was the Beatles' biggest market, and the releases were the same for the most part in both countries. But here it's different because Magical Mystery Tour comes out as a double EP in the UK and as a brilliant album in the US, thanks to Capitol's marketing ideas. So for this book, I do the UK first and then the US. And what's interesting is, I have to keep reminding myself and people in the US at this time, Rolling Stone was just coming out. And so not everybody was into Rolling Stone. They didn't know about it for the most part. Whereas in the UK, you had 4 weekly music magazines that kids could be buying. And so the way I wanted to approach it, and being a historian at heart, I wanted to say, okay, if I was a kid growing up in the UK, what would I have learned during this fantastic period after Pepper? And then the same thing, what would I have learned in the US? And it was funny because Yellow Submarine came out first in the UK by several months. Came out in the summer of 68. We didn't get it till, November, December 68 in the US. And because it came out there though, you could read about it. Rolling Stone in April of 68 had an article about it, which was kind of cool. And then when I was researching it, I found out that one of the first US magazines to report on the Beatles film was 17 magazine, not something that I was reading. McCall's magazine, not something I was reading. Look magazine, yeah, maybe I would see that in the school library. So there was a lot of things. And then there was this paperback edition of the plot of Yellow Submarine that came out a month before the film came out here. So by the time Yellow Submarine came out, some people knew a lot about it. Other people like me just went into the the theater and saw it. So it was really interesting to compare how all these things shook out. What did people know at what time? And I really found that fascinating.
The Beatles had very little to do with the Yellow Submarine film. The album is great, but in a way it's cast-offs and retreads from the studio. Any Beatles soundtrack makes a great soundtrack. Any song that the Beatles sing, to me, sound good. But did they reap a bounty with very little work on that animated feature?
I think there was a reviewer when he was talking about the film and how brilliant it was. And he said either the Beatles themselves produce brilliant music or they inspire others to do brilliant work for them. And I think that was an astute observation. The cartoons, the Saturday morning cartoons, these were kind of silly things. Brian didn't even want them shown in the UK. You had two actors doing the voices of the four Beatles using Americanized British accents, would be the politest way to describe it. And, the Beatles thought, oh, here we go again. Ringo's going to be shown as a buffoon and all these other silly things. But that isn't what happened. It was a brilliant one. And that was because they brought in some really good people to do this film, and that's what really made the difference. When they were recording the songs, yeah, Only a Northern Song wasn't good enough for Pepper. It's good enough for the friggin' cartoon. Oh, Paul, I've got this little silly song. 1, 2, 3, 4. Can I have a? Yep, good enough for the cartoon. Oh, we'll let George have 2 songs. That's what we think of the cartoon. But oddly enough, George's 2 songs hold up pretty darn well. Only a Northern Song holds up okay. It's All Too Much holds up great. And of course, Hey Bulldog, John's little knock it off before we go to see the Maharishi sounds great. So, and then side 2, don't underestimate that George Martin stuff. Side 2 is great instrumentals. One of the things I tell in the foreword to the book, when I was in high school, we had to do I took a film course and we had to do a film. And I was the one who selected the music for the film that we were doing. And I used music from, used March of the Meanies in one scene where our lead character was being hunted down by a gang and killed. And the music worked perfectly for it. And the film actually tied for first place for high school films in Louisiana. So, I've always loved the Yellow Submarine album, and I do play both sides of it. It's not like, dare I say it, Live Piece in Toronto, where side 1's been played about 1 million times more than side 2 throughout the world. Certainly worth playing.
I've heard this before, and I'm talking about MTV. Magical Mystery Tour has aged very well. It's a great soundtrack and it has nice DVD or stream to it. It seems to be that this is MTV. Am I correct?
Well, I think Helping a Hard Day's Night were MTV before MTV too. A song like Should Have Known Better. I mean, it's not a straight performance on stage, but yeah, they were really great videos, concept videos, more so than in the films. And it worked well. The other thing that the BBC gets a really bad rap about it because they say, the Beatles do this wonderful color Christmas special and the BBC shows it in black and white on Boxing Day And then a few days later, they show it in color, but the damage had already been done. If only they'd showed it in color the first time. Fortunately, I have friends over in the UK that set the record straight for me, and they said, "Look, Bruce, I saw it twice. Once on BBC One in black and white, and although BBC Two broadcast it in color, I saw it again in black and white because I didn't know anyone who had a color TV set." He said the only people that could have seen it in color would have been aristocrats, royalty, and the Beatles themselves. Everyone else had black and white TVs. That's just reality. Does it look better in color? Of course, it looks better in color.
Right. Yeah, everything looks better in color.
Except
right.
for A Hard Day's Night.
Hey, you got it. Thank you very much for that, and I'm going to hand it over to the Bulldog.
Just a little more on the new book. You mentioned Pepper, and Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane, if I'm correct, almost had made Pepper. And they're in Magical Mystery Tour, and as Warren said, with the Beatles soundtrack, it's really tough to, you're going to have whatever is, on with video. Like, you can't go wrong with whatever the Beatles put in as far as music. Yeah. But as for the Magical Mystery Tour album, as a kid, I had the Magical Mystery Tour album here in America, and it opened up. It had the booklet. It was a full album. And then for like a holiday present, I got, my mom let me pick out some records. And at a specialty store, I got the English one that opened up into two, and it was more like the side of a 45. And I wasn't used to EP, so I thought this was really cool. But could you just talk a little about that soundtrack and how it came to be and the differences between the American and the English release?
Yeah, this is a case where Capitol gets a grand slam, and the Beatles for the double EP, while it was an interesting idea and it looked very creative and cool because people hadn't seen double EPs with booklets like that, it's simply inferior. As a listening experience, let's think about, suppose you wanted to listen to all the songs on that Capitol album. By the way, Capitol had to get permission for that. They sent somebody over to London and said, "Look, this is what we want to do. We want to, EPs don't sell in the States. So we want to take the music from Magical Mystery Tour on one side, and then on the other side, we'll put stuff that's only been out in singles. Strawberry Fields, Penny Lane, Baby You're a Rich Man, All You Need Is Love, Hello Goodbye." And the Beatles, okay, that sounds good. And I'm sure they told Capitol, "We want you to issue it with the booklet." And Capitol said, "Of course we're going to." And Capitol's thinking, and we're going to charge $1 more. And probably the Beatles made it a condition, "No, you can't charge an extra $1. And so I think that's probably how that went down. I know Capitol was in London to get permission, but I never read anything about the pricing. But I suspect that was the case because the Beatles, for the Magical Mystery Tour thing, it basically told EMI it has to be available for under £1. And so EMI did not make a lot of profit per unit on that. But of course, it sold so well that they made a lot of money on it. They got rid of the EP charts by then. And so, of course, it would have topped the EP charts. But as it was, it got to number 2 on 3 of the singles charts and number 1 on 1 of the singles charts. But as a listening experience, I like the running order better that Capitol selected than on the EP. And part of that was on the EP, you needed 2 songs on one side and 1 on the other. So that meant shorter songs had to be paired on one side and a longer side on the other. But the running order Capitol used is just a better running order, 1 through 6. And then all those great songs on side 2. I think I forget the exact number of times you would have to get up and flip records to have that same listening experience. I think it's like 8 or 9. As opposed to just sitting back and flipping the album over one time. So Capitol really got it right on that one. And the proof of it is that it's the only Capitol album that became part of the Beatles' official catalog or core catalog. And EMI later put it out in album form too.
Very interesting. And now, like, there's this new phenomena, with the Beatles and with Bob Dylan and certainly with the Grateful Dead. They're coming up with these, extra tracks and, in some cases, live albums and things like that. I was wondering what you thought of this phenomena. Obviously, we all enjoy it because we're getting music we wouldn't have heard or we had to buy on bootlegs.
Yeah.
But isn't it kind of amazing, like, when we sit back and we look, this was recorded, say the Let It Be stuff in like basically 1969, and it's coming out today and it's causing such a stir. And then like these back, like how far into the future do you think we'll be seeing these projects? And what do you, maybe you already know, but what do you guess that Paul and Ringo might be, drumming up to put out as their next piece of work, like, similar to the ones that have come out?
I don't know what they're going to do next. You could either go backwards or you could start at the beginning and go forward, or just whatever fits your fancy. The way I kind of view it is I like the idea of combining certain albums. And this was the Magical Mystery Tour Yellow Submarine book is the first I did that in. But I think that I'll be combining some of the albums as well, the other ones. And not that each of these albums doesn't deserve its own book. It does. It's just that from a historical standpoint, the stories I'm trying to tell, it's not just me. I put together a team where, Pierce Hemmingson says what's going on in Canada. I write about the US and the UK. Al Sussman writes about what was going on in the world. Frank Daniels writes about what other great music was out there, what films were out there. And then I have these sections of fan recollections and then the recording histories of the songs. And I do that in all the books. But I think that somehow combining some of the albums, I think is probably the way I'm going to go moving forward.
Well, we certainly look forward, to all the ones that you put out. And again, I thought that your book was honestly better than the Get Back book that came out. The Beatles Finally Let It Be, and the stuff that we've seen in the Yellow Submarine Magical Mystery Tour book is fantastic. But when the listeners want to go and they want to find your work and purchase it and add it to their collection, and also where can they follow you to see what's up with you and maybe where you're doing book signings or what's coming up? Where can they find you?
Well, I am on social media, but I've honestly, I'm a full-time lawyer, so it's hard for me to spend a lot of time on it. But I'd suggest people go to my website, Beatle.net, and then sign up for the email blasts that we send out, a couple of times a month. We don't send them out every day, but we do send them out an average of maybe twice a month, let you know what's kind of going on and things of that nature. So by all means, go to Beatle.net and check out the books, and I hope you buy them. We have digital editions of the album series, which is, it started with Sgt. Pepper. We also have the White Album and the Launch of Apple. We have the Beatles Get Back to Abbey Road, and then we have the Beatles Finally Let It Be. And then the latest one, the Beatles Magical Mystery Tour and Yellow Submarine. And yes, there'll be another book in the series that will probably come out, sometime maybe next October. I'm just guessing. But do check that out. And as I've said, you can get a free download starting in mid-December of the Beatles Finally Let It Be, which is about all the product that's come out recently. One thing I do want to mention, and I have listened to a lot of bootlegs, and one of the things that attracted my fancy was the Beatles, while they were working on Two of Us, John and Paul are on acoustic guitars for that song, and they do this wonderful rendition of Bye Bye Love, and it sounds terrible. The reason it sounds terrible is Ringo and George are practicing their parts for Two of Us. And while John and Paul are doing Bye Bye Love, George is doing this, dun, 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 and Ringo's doing dun, 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 dun. It's horrible. I had read in Mark Lewison's book that was recorded on the 8-track. And I thought, boy, it would be great if they took that on the 8-track and just gave us John and Paul doing Bye Bye Love with their acoustic guitars and vocals. And my prayers were answered in the Peter Jackson Get Back documentary, where they do indeed have John and Paul doing Bye Bye Love. And to me, that is one of my absolute favorite moments in the film.
Well, it's funny, as I was watching it, I know songwriting royalties have to come into it, but when they seem to be struggling, yes, when they seem to be struggling to put a song list together, John Lennon had done the rock and roll album, and later Paul did that Russian album of all rock standards. Like, I wonder, again, if they'd done it under normal studio conditions, it would have been kind of cool if they had gotten a covers album that they really put a lot of work into.
They would not have needed to put a lot of work into it. And the Beatles' best covers, some of those were one-take knockouts. Long Tall Sally, boom, done. So it would not have been a lot of work to do it. They just were beyond doing that, and they were loosening up with these songs, and it was fun. But most of them are terrible performances. They can't remember the words. It would have been horrendous to put out an album of it. I would have liked to have seen a little bit more of it in this film, but once again, it's nearly 8 hours long. So
Yeah,
if
definitely.
Peter Jackson could have had it as 4 parts and made it nearly 10 or 11 hours long, I suppose he would have had more of it. But look, it isn't exactly the 8 hours I would have picked, but he picked a lot of really great stuff, and and I really love it.
Well spoken. And Warren and Bruce, we end up our shows, we close with a tradition where we sing from Abbey Road, or we try to sing. It's more about the fun. But we close out with the end. Will you guys join me in that?
I thought we did Maxwell Silverhammer, but okay, I'll do the end.
Back in school again, Bruce has a book again. I can't. But so you guys will help me with the rhyme. A 1 and a 2 and a, and in the end,
the love you take
is equal to the love you make. All right.
Scratchy throat and all.
good work.
That was a scratchy throat interview there.
Interesting
maybe,
stuff.
Maybe
Thank
the
you.
next one we can do a little earlier in the day. But anyway, Bruce, I thank you for coming on, and I'd appreciate it if you come on again when your new book comes out.
I do appreciate that. Yeah, let people know about the, like I said, it'll be available for download, I would think in, mid-December, definitely.
I think the art of record producing is very like that of a film or television director. You've got to get the best out of the person who is either in front of the microphone or the camera. And some directors do it by bullying, and I don't think it's a very good way of doing things. I've never done that. Other directors do it by suggesting and leading and hoping that the path that the actor takes is to their liking. And the only curbing you do is if it does become over the top or excessive. But you let them ride with it and hope that their genius will come through.